So all about international security today. Thank you so much for joining us. Our CIA operative, Mr. Keys, is joining us, as well as Ryan Mcbeth, a security expert. You were just in Brussels recently attending the NATO conference. What did you learn?
I learned quite a few things. I learned that NATO's resolve and commitment is stronger than ever, especially when it comes to supporting Ukraine. I met with about 7 Ukrainian residents and soldiers, including some journalists, who are ready to finish the fight against Russia and make their country free again.
You know, Mr. Operative, we always welcome you on the platform. I find it fascinating that the ICC, The Hague, has issued an arrest warrant for Mr. Netanyahu and his former defense minister, Mr. Gallant. And yet, I've never heard The Hague issue an arrest warrant for the heads of Hamas, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hezbollah, or the head of any terrorist organization. You never heard of The Hague issuing arrest warrants following the October 7th, 2023 massacre by Hamas. I mean, is this just sheer hypocrisy or just laughable?
It is laughable, Armstrong, and the international community. It looks like a staged event. It's not serious, and there's nothing that people don't pay attention much to The Hague because there's never any end point. Nothing ever happens, or so rare that something happens. But coming out against the leader of the country and his minister of defense and ignoring the horrific events of October 7th, it's absurd in the extreme.
You know, I was so glad that President Biden said it was absolutely outrageous. You know, I was trying to figure out what was Mr. Biden trying to do with Zelensky and giving him permission to use long-range missiles, whether he was trying to sabotage Trump before coming into the White House. But Ryan, you have a different take on it. Share it with our audience.
Yeah, I believe he's setting President Trump up for success. You know, it's in everyone's best interest, not just NATO's and Europe's best interest, but in the United States' best interest to have a secure Europe. And I think that President Biden realized what he was doing before, which was giving Ukraine little bits and pieces of weapon systems piecemeal. It was enough to prevent Ukraine from losing, but not enough for them to win. It's almost like give a firefighter being told, okay, you can only make the fire damp. You can't put out the fire in the house. So I think one of the things that we've seen is President Biden is trying to get these long-range weapons into Ukraine so that Ukraine can strike logistical targets inside Russia, which will give Ukraine a better platform for negotiation if Russia and Ukraine can come to the bargaining table under President Trump. So he's setting up Trump for success.
Mr. Operative, do you challenge his insightfulness on this issue?
Yeah, I look at it a little bit differently because you have to factor in the history of the Russian system and how they view their homeland and their frame of mind on where they fit in history. And the one thing that has always been a mainstay of the Russian military is their ability and willingness to use heavy artillery in a way that few other countries have used it. And if they decide that they are going to start pounding on Ukraine because of the increase in escalation, these measured responses and these measured activities and the incrementalism of the way the West does things, this has produced 2 lost wars in our last 23 years. The Russians, if they let loose against Ukraine, they can pound that country with heavy artillery and surface-to-surface missiles 24/7. and they can leave the country in rubble, and there won't be a lot to negotiate over when it stops. This is one of those wars where we shouldn't have let it begin, and now that it's begun, we don't have any good outcome solutions. And for the life of me, I don't know what the end state is. If there is one that the U.S. policy is aiming at, it would be nice to have it announced. What is the end state they're seeking? This is why we lost after 9/11 in 2 theaters. When you start a war, you should have a goal and an end point on what you declare as victory. These endless wars that we get involved in, we're not designed to do that, and it becomes quickly an immoral action where the civilians are the ones that pay the price, and then you grind up the infrastructure of the country in the war and lead people into refugee status where they're fleeing because they're starving or they're exposed to the elements. We're going into winter in Central Europe. It is soon going to be horrific to stay alive outside. If your house is gone and you're living outside, I always ask people to look at the framework of history. When the Russians decided to pound on Germany, there was no stopping them. They were a machine, and they turned Berlin into gravel. There was nothing left in Europe when the Germans finally surrendered. They had lost everything. And the Russians just sent wave after wave after wave of soldiers in there to destroy the place.
Hold that point, Mr. Operative. I'm Armstrong Williams, and we'll be back. So you wanted to respond to Mr. Operative.
Oh, absolutely. Look, everyone has different opinions based on our strategic assessments and based on our histories. And this, I believe right now, this strength that Russia has, it's a Maskrova. It's a facade. They've done this with Potemkin villages when they set up entire villages of friendly people and grain bins that were full of food that were really nothing more than facades. And behind that facade is essentially nothing, bare buildings. One of the reasons that Russia used North Korean troops in Kursk is that they literally can't afford to have another mobilization, another general mobilization. The first time there was a general mobilization, Putin almost lost control of his country. And for the longest time in Russia, there's essentially been a deal between the leader of Russia and the elites in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Do whatever you want with the minorities inside Russia, but don't touch our children. The second you touch our children, there's going to be a problem. And so Russia can't do a second mobilization. So that's why they got the North Koreans to do some fighting for them in Kursk. They desperately need men. They are short of manpower. And you might be able to pummel Ukraine, but Russia doesn't need a reason. There doesn't need to be an escalation to give them an excuse to do that. They do that naturally. The reason that Russia has stepped up their attacks, and I was just at NATO headquarters in Brussels last week in order to learn about some of this stuff. They've stepped up these attacks because they're trying to destroy Ukraine's power grid and put people out in the cold. One of the major things Ukraine needs right now are Soviet-era transformers in order to repair their infrastructure. And one of the ways we can stop this is arming Ukraine with more missile systems, more anti-aircraft missile systems, which, again, Biden slow-walked aid to Ukraine, and this is what we get when we don't show strength.
You know, Mr. Operative, Iran says that it's activating new centrifuges after being condemned by the UN nuclear watchdog. What does that mean?
I don't disagree with your other guest's assessment. I understand completely where he's coming from, and I get it, and it does make sense. they are in a manpower shortage, and their main forces, their really heavy divisions that have the best commanders, are all up on the Chinese border deployed because there's a vulnerability there for them for strategic minerals and stuff such. However, standoff weapons platforms, they can pound the power grid into sand in Ukraine, and by December, January, it's going to be horrific there. And there'll be starvation issues, there'll be mass exodus, people on the road. That's what started in northern Iraq back in the 1991, was people fleeing in the wintertime in the mountains. And there were more people frozen to death than there were killed in combat. We have worked ourselves into a very complicated box where we're a long way from home. We've already had two major conflagrations in Europe in the last century. And here we are in 2024, we're getting ready to start a third on the Central European plains. And we don't have an exit strategy. I cannot discern what is their goal. If they're going to negotiate, then negotiate now before you create a absolute calamitous exodus from the battle space. Now's the time to move on this. You don't want to just buy time for the next 90 days when it's going to be really cold by the time we go to the inauguration and they change hands. And then Trump's got essentially a status quo on his desk that is unmanageable. And if he's proven anything, he does not want to send troops to war. This can be sorted out. It just needs to have a bold move right now. Send an emissary to Moscow.
What is, Ryan, what are the critical selections for the president-elect in terms of that would have the greatest impact on foreign policy? What does it tell you at this point about his foreign policy and what you think his policy will be?
Well, I think the greatest selection you could make is someone who understands that there is a new axis of evil, and that is Russia, China, and Iran, especially China. China will be invading Taiwan in either October of 2027 or April of 2028. The president of China has told his troops to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. We need to get people in office who understand what a threat China is. We also need people who understand that we need to increase our industrial base. Right now we have essentially four shipyards that can build Navy ships. This is down from, I believe, 12 or 14 in the 1990s. All those shipyards are gone. China can beat us ship for ship. So we need people who understand the plan to defeat China, which is to have many allies in the Pacific, the theory of any sensor, any decider, any shooter, meaning an Australian Special Forces guy should be able to talk to an American AWACS command and control plane because he sees a Chinese ship and the command and control plane tells the Filipino HIMARS fire a rocket at this ship. We need people who are willing to work with our allies and get our shipbuilding back up into order, since we've lost so many capabilities as we've lost shipyards. So that would be the critical factors of any person who gets into President Trump's administration in the defense space.
I'm Armstrong Williams, and we'll be back with much more.
It is easier to build up strong children than to try and repair broken men.
The streets are plagued with crime, violence. There's a lot of poverty, and it's all a result of lack of education that's happening in our schools. So it really is a crisis.
We come from very different political perspectives, but we've come to the same conclusion. And that is, there is a crisis in the classroom. Children are being deprived of quality of life because they're being deprived of a good education. We must solve this problem. It's incumbent upon all of us to join hands together to get this done.
We can't afford to wait one more day before we address these issues, because every day we lose another child.
Let's stop the politicking. Let's stop the games. Let's really do something to give these kids a real chance at life and being a part of that American dream.
We need accountability for funding. Many of the districts where you're seeing very low test scores, students graduating with very low literacy and math comprehension rates, they are receiving a lot of funding. So where is the money going where our kids aren't being adequately educated?
If you believe every child is deserving of a quality education, please go to educationjusticefoundation.com. Mr. Operative, President Trump would like to give the CIA and especially the FBI a special MAGA makeover. What does that mean as it relates to his feeling that the deep state is one of the greatest threats to America today?
I think he's on the right track, but I would never try and understand exactly what he means when he says something like that. A makeover can be quite an undertaking, but there are ways to rein it in, to restructure it. It's important to note that the intelligence community in large measure has not changed much since 1989, when the Cold War system in Eastern Europe collapsed. We're still basically structured the same way. There's been some nibbling around the edges of changing the wiring diagram, but it hasn't substantively changed the way we do business. And that's what has been lacking for a long, long time and must be addressed. It's also way too big. The size of the intelligence community is an awful drain on resources, with people in excess and leaks and all the things that come from having too many people reading highly classified things. It needs to be pruned down. There is a makeover requirement, and there's opinions that are as broad as the intel community is itself physically, that on how to do it. But I believe there's going to be some major surgery done on the structures of these federal bureaucracies, because many of them are bloated mess that are not accountable. They're not controllable. They say we have oversight, and the truth of it is we do not. And you have unelected people in large numbers in buildings scattered all over Northern Virginia and Maryland and Washington that have unchecked power and ability to do things, to attack and complicate the lives of Americans. I don't see where we've done anything that really has put a dent in what the Russians or Chinese are doing inside the country. And I would add one thing to Ryan's comment about that axis, the new axis. He is spot on. I would add on Cuba, Venezuela to that list, because you've got 5 countries, and we have notoriously been poor at assessing the capacity and abilities and determination of both Venezuela and especially Cuba since 1963. We have just gotten it wrong, and they have stolen our lunch money consistently. And the Iranians and the Cubans working together have cleaned our clock in Lebanon and other areas. We are not structured right. We are poorly led as a service, and we are missing the game. We are not engaged on the playing field properly. And I can't imagine how poor the product is to the president on what's really going on.
You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go to break early so I can come back with more time in our final segment. I'm Armstrong Williams. Don't go away.
As a home buyer, you need a lender who cares about your home ownership dreams. United Security Financial has been helping families secure their dream homes for 30 years. We're a national fair practice lender that provides affordable mortgages and low down payment programs to eligible home buyers. To learn how United Security Financial can help you secure your dream home, call 1-800-373-4186.
What is the end game to bring the conflict in Israel to a halt?
Well, the end game is treating Hamas and Hezbollah down to a point where they are combat ineffective. And in some ways, Israel had a great leap forward with this when it came to them attacking Iran, where they said, like, we can reach out and touch you anytime we want, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it. The fact of the matter is that very few actual weapons and systems are manufactured inside of Gaza and inside of southern Lebanon. These are brought in from other places. So one of the things that Israel can do is just keep up the pressure and keep grinding, because they can get weapons, they can build weapons, and they can refill their ranks a lot faster than Hamas and Hezbollah can. Hamas has been attrited down to maybe about less than a brigade of troops. They're not really a force to be reckoned with inside of Gaza anymore. And Hezbollah is a lot bigger, and they still have weapon systems. And one other thing that's kind of interesting, as the war between Ukraine and Russia go on, there's just fewer weapons sloshing around the international community to actually get into southern Lebanon to have an effect on Israel. So yeah, there have been weapon systems like Coronet that have been captured in southern Lebanon. Coronet is an anti-tank missile. It's a Russian anti-tank missile. So Russia is a factor in this, and Russia's support of the Syrian government has allowed weapons to filter into that area. So,
Mr. Operative, in the few minutes that we have left, what is it we have not covered that needs discussing?
I think you've hit on the major factors, and Ryan and I might sound like we're disagreeing on a lot of stuff, but we're not. He is on the money. And these issues that we have, there are systemic issues in our own system that we face, but we're also facing the challenges of the battle space and the structure that we actually have on how we address these issues. When you play into the strengths of the enemy, the war gets a lot harder. And I think our last 23 years in Afghanistan and Iraq has demonstrated with precision that the Chinese, Russians, Iranians, Cubans, and Venezuelans know the American government, the American system can be beaten through subversive warfare. They don't, as long as you stay out of the teeth of the United States military, you'll be able to carry on and continue and really cause difficulties for the United States. And that's what they're doing. And it terrifies me that we have been figured out. And we built the finest fighting force and equipment for that fighting force, I believe, in human history, especially the special operations capability. We cannot be defeated on the ground fighting with the military. However, if you stay out of the teeth of the military and it becomes an intelligence-based surrogate war, we are vulnerable because our intelligence services are not nimble and they're not properly structured, deployed, and equipped to do what we need to do today. We're still operating under the 1989 model. And the Russians have changed completely how they deploy around the world, how they meet spies, how they penetrate hostile targets that they have. We're still doing it the old-fashioned way, which is not working for us. And we are exposed. And this subversion program in the United States, where everybody's at each other's throats, that's not an accident. There's a deliberate effort. And the Chinese wrote a book about it that is not as popular as I thought it would have been, sweeping across the government years ago. They wrote the book in 1999, Unrestricted Warfare. There was a thesis project by two of their special operations colonels in their own war college, and they wrote a book called Unrestricted Warfare.
And I encourage people to go out and get Unrestricted Warfare. It's a great book. Mr. Operative, and I want to thank both of you for joining us today. Ryan Mcbeth, it's always a pleasure. Thank you for joining us for this edition of the Armstrong Williams Show.
Thanks, Armstrong.